if there is another space that we want to respond to some of those or pick them up in a continued conversation. So this session will be recorded. It just started being recorded, and will be shared via our Brain Center YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access it there if you want to go back and revisit some of the ideas that were shared or some of the resources that are shared. And Dr. Garrison has also provided a list of additional resources that you may want to check out to continue learning and future engagement. And those will be posted at www.bw/civic. So easy enough to find. I do want to take a moment to talk a little bit about the series. So, we recognize that systemic racism is deeply ingrained across all of our institutions and within the fabric of our culture. And this is why we thought a multidisciplinary lens and understanding of this topic is really essential for informed action and sustained efforts towards change. As we begin this series with a lens on racism and racial justice, in some ways, these sessions are really just the beginning. They serve as the planting of a seed for new ideas and developing some shared understanding. But at the same time, I also want to make sure to acknowledge that many of those who were involved in the creation and facilitation and presentation of these sessions have really been working tirelessly for racial equity and racial justice over the course of their lives and the course of their careers. So while this work is complex, the intentions of the series were simple. We wanted to start campus conversations, we wanted to provide resources, and really help our BW community to connect and begin to build relationships from a very preliminary shared space of understanding. We hope to develop new ideas together and to create ideas that can lead to concrete and sustained action and engagement, both on campus and in larger networks. So we know that these conversations alone are not enough, but we hope that they are a foundation to stand on. I want to be clear, we recognize that this series is by no means comprehensive either in academic perspective or in lived experience. But again, we hope it's a platform for sharing and learning that we can continue to build upon in the upcoming year together. So with that being said, if you have a story to tell or a topic you'd like to explore, we encourage you to reach out. We currently have a great lineup of faculty who will be sharing their expertise this summer, but we really hope to expand this series to include student, staff, and community partner voices as well. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the potential impact of racial trauma and encourage our attendees to prioritize your own self-care. Some of the topics explored by this series, as well as visuals and language in today's presentation, can be personally, emotionally, and intellectually challenging to engage with for some, so please just recognize that. Finally, this session is really rooted in the expectations established by BW's community standards of conduct. So with that, we expect this to be a space where we can engage together empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully. So with those introductions, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. James Garrison, who has been with us at BW for a year now. He serves as Assistant Professor of Philosophy. Previously has served as the Consortium for Faculty Diversity Fellow at Scripps College and a Teaching Fellow at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. Obtained his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Vienna, Austria, after an exchange fellowship with the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Peking University. His teaching and research interests includes work in ethics, aesthetics, social and political philosophy, philosophy of gender, and intercultural philosophy. Working under the guidance of Professor Roger Ames at the University of Hawaii, he developed his forthcoming book, Reconsidering the Aesthetic Life of Power. Additionally, he's taught philosophy of race, ethics, and literature, Black philosophical thought, Africana philosophy, and Black Lives Matter courses. And he's developing a new book, which we're going to get a sneak peek into today, titled Black Bodies That Matter. So thank you so much, Dr. Garrison, for volunteering to be a part of this during your busy summer and for sharing your work and expertise with us. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Okay, great. Is anything showing?
Yeah.
Well, we'll just do it like this.
Okay.
We'll just do it in the app.
Sure.
It won't be completely optimal, but it'll have to do.
Sure.
So, okay, thank you, everybody. Let's get to it. So, this is my project, Black Bodies That Matter. And as mentioned, there may be some things in here that are triggering, both with regard to the thematic content, as racial violence is part of the issue here. as well as some of the visuals being shared. There will also be some rough language. I'll here be speaking elliptically, so like son of a, I won't be fully enunciating the rougher words, but I just do want to prime everybody for this because it is perhaps traumatic for people, and I do understand that. I should also say, by way of preface, that this is something of an initial effort for work that will, as mentioned, take place in printed form. I have a book contract for this, and I'll be developing this over the next few months into a full book-length text. But also for teaching at BW. This is somewhat preparatory. I'll be teaching in the spring semester a course on philosophy of race, looking at a variety of perspectives, not just the Black perspective, in context of critical theory and some of the approaches to race that will be outlined here in this presentation. And also in 2021-2022 academic year, I'll be teaching an honors course on called Ethics in Literature, Black Philosophical Thought. And this will be addressing some stuff that that isn't quite in my wheelhouse. I'm not a literature professor, and some students and faculty out there might have some input on this, as well as the more philosophical material. And so I'm thinking that this can be the beginning of a two-way conversation or a many-way conversation, and that maybe I can steal a little bit of good insight from people in the BW community, a little bit selfishly. So anyways, with that said, I will get into the presentation proper. So we have this opening quote that I'd like to share. This is from Judith Butler, and she is a major figure in queer theory, operating out of the University of California, Berkeley, somebody who, around whom I've based a lot of my own work. And while she largely focuses on queer theory, her approach to social and political philosophy is rather robust and complex, and the sort of thing that can be extended. So my book is called Black Bodies That Matter, and this is riffing off of a Judith Butler book called Bodies That Matter. It was released in 1993. I'll get into how I'm extending her work. But for the time being, Butler, in an interview from the New York Times with prominent Black philosopher George Yancey, talking about the kinds of things that we're all grappling with right now, said the following, saying that stand your ground and racist killings are increasingly normalized, which is why intelligent forms of collective outrage have become obligatory. For my own part, yeah, I don't really know if there's any avoiding this. It's never really been much of an option for me. It might have been an option for people out there with a different background, perhaps. But I think a lot of people are reaching a point, or reaching this same kind of judgment for themselves. So, while much can be said and has been said on these topics around Black Lives Matter from within a quasi-legal framework, we have here people like Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, founders of the Black Lives Movement, as well as figures like Angela Davis, who's been a landmark figure in this for quite some time, and Michelle Alexander. We're using techniques from the field of critical legal studies more and more to account for the losses experienced by Black Americans. My approach, though, is a bit different and is aiming at addressing these losses in philosophical terms, addressing questions of loss and of not fully mattering. So to continue, I'd like to juxtapose here. We have a picture of Butler, the author who's going to be driving a lot of my inquiry. And what I want to present here is just a little bit from her 93 book, Bodies That Matter. And here we have on the right side of the screen a picture of Washington, D.C., and we have juxtaposed the Washington Monument, and the AIDS quilt. We have what we call the hypervisibility of Washington. George Washington, that's the man, the general, the president, the namesake of the city, the namesake of my home state, Washington State, and with the monument here made extremely visible, extremely prominent within America's collective memory. Whereas on the other hand, there are other people who are lost in various ways and are not lionized like Washington, not documented, not memorialized. Butler's contention is that when loss isn't fully acknowledged, when it's not memorialized, that social problems develop, that basically incomplete mourning creates the kind of ghosts around society's collective psyche, and that these need to be exercised in some way. We need to complete the act of mourning. And so what we see here, the AIDS quilt, is for her a paradigmatic example of how people that don't typically matter, people whose mortality might be diminished in importance, how that can be externalized and corrected in some way. So we have here this example of the AIDS quilt that we'll perhaps be returning to later on in the presentation. Okay, continuing forward. So Butler is really instructive here as regard public memorials. And she's drawing on in her work from Bodies That Matter and another book, The Psychic Collective Power, that I taught in a class last semester. She's drawing together a lot of stuff that's going on in critical theory, and I won't get into the deep end of it, but we'll start with some names out there. Maybe they're sources that you've dealt with before. She's looking at Michel Foucault and the idea of the subject as a kind of prisoner in society. She's looking at a figure named Louis Althusser. Here I'm presenting a little bit of his work, this notion of interpellation. This is a technical term and something I'll return to a little bit later. But this is basically what happens when you hear a voice that says, "Hey, you there!" And, well, what happens? Well, you turn around. You turn around, and in that moment of turning around, that speech act, that "hey, you there," creates the you in question. It creates a you that turns around, and a kind of turn of conscience, seeing yourself as the target of that accusation. And so my project looks at resonances within her account with the experience of many Black people within the broader African diaspora. These are experiences that are often marked by violence, by surveillance, by imprisonment, and encounters with the ominous voice of authority. My approach then works to supplement Butler's appropriation of the psychoanalytic vocabulary of melancholy with technical insights into anxiety. So this is drawing from Sigmund Freud here, and then extending this with examinations of Black experiences, particularly with a focus on literature, and using these as examples and basis for further investigation. So there's a history here, an often covered over history. It's one that goes well beyond our current internet age. And this is a history that includes figures like Emmett Till, Rodney King, a number of unthinkable and undocumented dead throughout history. It includes police-related deaths of people that are maybe more familiar to us here in this audience here in 2020. So people like Sandra Bland, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice, Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Rekia Boyd, Kayla Moore, Eric Garner, Stephen Clark, Danny Ray Thomas, Botham John, Willie McCoy, Jamel Robertson, E.J. Bradford, Tatiana Jefferson, and of course, more recently, and these are just the most prominent, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. And all of these instances have drawn attention to sometimes fatal structural inequalities in the American justice system when it comes to race. These tragic incidents, combined with other incidents around the world, combined with non-police related but still homicidal actions by people like George Zimmerman and Roof, have all prompted a great deal of discussion about Black lives and deaths more generally. Still waiting to see how this manifests in terms of action. Going back to the matter at hand, though, whereas Judith Butler's writings provide a framework for understanding such shadow populations, primarily in terms of gender and sexuality, I intend to bring race and class into the mix in order to draw thematic attention to the construction of Black bodies and how their disposable, forgotten mortality still matters as it should. So here I want to introduce another technical term. This is something that students from my Philosophy 314 class have heard me speak about ad nauseum, but it's pretty darn important. So this term is subjectivation. And this is basically the process of becoming a subject, becoming a person in everyday society, as understood by Butler and extending a body of work drawn from Michel Foucault. So for Judith Butler, the consideration of certain bodies going unmourned, not matter, takes place in the context of gender theory. Nonetheless, her extension of Foucault's paradigm, subjectivation, is meant to be broadly applicable to people in general. Her description of subjectivation as the formation of subjects, people being turned on themselves, that turn of conscience that we alluded to earlier, is meant to apply very broadly, even to people that we might presume to be privileged. So this is something that applies to white people, to heterosexual people, to cis people, to men. This is something for Butler really the human condition. It just happens to be the case that certain subjects, in order to survive, experience that turn, that circuit of self-consciousness as extraordinarily fraught with tension. So when I talk about that circuit of self-consciousness, I'm talking about this experience of watching yourself, of having awareness of oneself that also plays out in conscience, self-consciousness and moral conscience. This idea of watching oneself and thinking, what should I do? And moreover, seeing oneself in this moral moment through the eyes of other people. And with certain people experiencing this with more tension, we have a sort of fundamental founding disparity. And so it is that all subjects start with loss, and indeed there's certain founding losses as we grow up, where certain social possibilities are foreclosed in a way that never goes acknowledged or mourned. So these might be dreams of becoming a basketball player or a superhero or whatever. There might be more tangible losses too, and all of these are formative of our sense of self, our self-consciousness. And where for Freud, when losses, big or small, from dreams to friends, lost loves, lost parents, etc., to just slights, to insults in the everyday, the losses that we experience on that level, when those losses aren't properly mourned, those ghosts of those losses live on. And so what we call the superego, and what Freud, in a landmark essay, Mourning and Melancholia, defines as melancholia. Incomplete mourning, you have melancholia. Melancholia being the persisting condition of everyday life in Butler's analysis. In any case, certain vulnerable people need to be hard, if not ruthless, in monitoring and punishing themselves, lest they lose what small purchase on social recognition and legitimacy and belonging that they have in the everyday that allows them even just melancholic survival. Certain people, it's people that experience more vulnerability, are more likely to hear rather than to yell out aloud, "Hey, you!" The kinds of demands that instill paralyzing mode of self-consciousness. And these people need to steel themselves more just to be present in the everyday. So this is what I seek to get across by this concept of subjectivation. Now here I'm going a little bit into the history of philosophy, and I don't want to get too technical here. I have some material up on the screen. Read through it if you're able to keep up. But here, this is really important, and I want to present this also because this is going to be the basis of the work that I'm doing at BW and the courses that I'm presenting in spring semester and in 21-22 academic year. Where when we look at a lot of the texts on philosophy of race, a lot of the stuff that's really important to me and that I'm going to lay out here as we develop things, a lot of it traces back to this figure, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or we can just call him Hegel for the time being. And what I'm trying to do here is, well, I'm trying to work in a way that's not reducing Black experience to its most tragic aspects or to like a singular plight, a singular story. My thinking here is that plural Black perspectives can enrich what's going on with Hegel and what's called this master-slave dialectic, where there's a certain logic underlying our relationship to other people that plays out through founding power disparities. Hegel talked about it in terms of mastery and slavery. It has obvious resonances with Black experience, and these have been taken up in substantial ways within subsequent Black philosophy and literature. Just a couple of examples that I can give off the top of my head, and I'll include some of these as sources for you to perhaps investigate yourselves. These might be like W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, the work of Frantz Fanon, particularly Black Skin, White Masks, and Wretched of the Earth. More recent efforts from people like Paul Gilroy in England and Bell Hooks, perhaps the philosophical driving force behind Orange is the New Black, amongst other things. Anyways, this body of work, all drawing on Hegel and this sort of founding insight into self-consciousness being developed through our encounters with the other, the big bad other, with that voice, that hey you. All of this can be brought to bear in unpacking what's going on with these real world incidents that are confronting all of us. So, oh, pardon me, I got a little bit ahead of myself. Forgive me, back a slide. So whether this is occurring in the US, South Africa, Brazil, Canada, UK, as mentioned, France, wherever, many Black people still grappling with the ills of colonialism and slavery have perilous relationships to police authority and the powers of the state. This is precisely why Black Lives Matter has a meaning throughout wide domains of the Black diaspora. It doesn't require a lot of explanation. Whether it goes under this contemporary slogan or is thought of in terms of this vast prior history, this scene that Louis Althusser sets of interpellation of that hey you, confirmation of the you and turning around and becoming that self-conscious you in question. This, on the one hand, is really esoteric theory, but as I just said, it's stuff that really it clicks with the Black experience and it's lived experience. And when you hear it posing these theoretical terms, it can be, I don't want to say salutary, but it makes sense. There's a certain intuitiveness about it. And so what Butler and Althusser talk about is an experience that's largely figurative for a lot of dominant populations. And hence interpellation is understood as applying to subjects generally in terms of sort of more subtle scenes, being called out. Although Butler does devote a lot of her talk to precarious subjects, to queer subjects, to do here that hey you, often as a prelude to violence. While Black people also experience interpellation dispersed in terms of sort of small scale losses, slights, insults, and things like that, many Black people undergo something very close to the scene that Althusser describes in real life. I know I certainly have, and I can talk about that if needed. This means being subject to life and death stakes, perhaps more than most populations in modern liberal democracies. And this is particularly sadly true when it comes to Black and queer populations, all the more so with trans populations. So here I'm going to go into a slightly more literary mode for a moment, if you'll allow the indulgence. Imagine stumbling out into the night after last call, walking home down a dark, lonely street as a Black person. Hey, you! Hey, boy! Hey, you Black, but hey! For many of us, recall more than imagination is necessary to put us in that position of being called out in this way. While there are different levels of threat in each real-world iteration of these calls, the imperative to decide quickly cuts past all of that. There's barely time to think. Reflex waxes and reflection wanes. But before that happens, there's just enough time for a thought or two. Is this it? Do I turn around? Of course I do. Because who has time to consider if the call was really for me? But if I turn around, is that the last thing I ever do? There are last calls, and there are last calls. Is this it? And so, despite the pregnancy of this pause, it's almost certain that I turn around. After all, there's a way that these things go. Mere presence on the social scene begets a curious kind of what Butler calls ritual performativity. Big word, means simply going around and playing a part, following scripts in order to get by in the everyday, if not survive nights like these. This is true for straight folk, queer folk, for white people and people of color. It is merely the simple fact that sort of dominant modes of privilege are hegemonic precisely to the extent that the ultimate contingency of such roles, the ultimate contingency of such disparities goes unacknowledged. So this is what Butler has in mind with her very famous view that all gender is drag. It's a very famous quote from Butler, and I'll just repeat it as it's perhaps provocative and is worth ruminating over. Again, for Judith Butler, all gender is drag. What she means by this is that everybody, all parties, are putting on a contingent gender show that goes well past any normal or normative baseline that could ever be disclosed from biological sex. So here we might ask if pink being for girls or blue being for boys is somehow ordained by nature's fiat. I suspect not, and history bears this out also. In any case, many people being deluded into thinking that the show's scripts like these are actually necessary, are unable to sense or cognize that they walk around in what are essentially skin-tight prisons. Butler, drawing on Hannah Arendt and Adriana Cavarero, of somewhat more recent, Cavarero being a contemporary, goes on within this domain of feminist theory to explain her in her more recent work how this ultimately comes down to vulnerability on the social scene. Vulnerability is the key word. It plays out in small-scale scenes of the everyday and in large-scale moments of threat, like this late-night scene that occur when we're interrogated, implicitly or explicitly. This means in some way being challenged. Again, it might be sort of in between the lines thing, but being asked, who are you really? This means being made to give an account of oneself and the long history of one's social presence. It outstrips anything that we as finite individuals came into this world in a set of social relationships that are well beyond our particular responsibility. This story is far beyond anything we might be able to tell. especially when all of us as people are constituted at a basic level by melancholy and the losses that we cannot, by definition, put into words. And so with this background in place, this is all the sort of Butler stuff and this constellation critical theory that informs my work. The intention is that this book-length project that I'm developing will be built from chapters presented at conferences that I've been doing and at occasions like this. And so I'd like now to move and present the work that I'll be doing in the chapters. And I'll try to move quickly if I'm able. Am I okay in terms of time?
Yeah, you're doing great. Thanks so much.
Okay. So here we have some disturbing images. I would apologize for these images, but I don't think it's for me to apologize here. So here my first chapter is Invulnerability, question mark. And here I'm going to start by presenting Butler's paradigm and examining her notion of ritual performativity, that kind of script following, in less obvious dimensions in Black life. And I'll be drawing on sources like Du Bois, and there's a famous scene that I investigated in a few of my classes, actually, where in the first chapter, Souls of Black Folk withheld the recognition of his childhood gift in a kind of Valentine's Day-like gift exchange that marks the dawn of his double consciousness. He's aware of himself as a problem in that moment of refused recognition, where this plays out in the scenes of incredulity described by Franz Fanon, when white passersby confront the fact of his blackness really, really candidly. So hearing a child yell out and point and say, "Look, mommy, a Negro." It's kind of gauche moments. Or this is like what happens to me every time I find myself with the last empty seat on an otherwise packed bus and am confronted with a low-level but ubiquitous truth of my Black life not mattering or being worthy of this basic esteem by my fellow citizens. Drawing on instances like these, as well as quantitative medical and psychological studies showing the pervasive myth of a Black resiliency to pain and loss, I intend to demonstrate in the manner of Bell Hooks's landmark work, Ain't I a Woman, and following her insights into the continued entrenchment of Black Amazon, Aunt Jemima Mammy, Jezebel, and Sapphire stereotypes, the way in which the recent appreciation of the aesthetics of vulnerability on the part of often white feminist theorists fails to account for the imputation of a false invulnerability in the construction of Blackness, and how this invulnerability plays out in particular intersections of race, class, and gender. The interview mentioned at the beginning with George Yancey, Judith Butler observes, quote, "So the police see a threat when there's no gun to see, or someone is subdued and crying out for his life when they are moving away or cannot move. These figures are perceived as threats even when they do not threaten, when they have no weapon, and the video footage that shows precisely this is taken to be a ratification of the police's perception," end quote. Hence, what I want to argue for my own part is it's not just the perception of the other, the big bad other, as vulnerable that leads subjects following scripts in order to survive, but it's also the perception of that other as invulnerable, as in some way powerful because of difference, and that perception of possible invulnerability combined with vulnerability ends up being a paramount in Black life, particularly in America. So where vulnerability and invulnerability reinforce each other, where Black bodies were vulnerable to enslavement precisely because of widespread appraisal on the part of slavers that they were invulnerable with respect to brutal labor conditions in the New World. They were supposed to be similar to Africa and to agricultural modes of production, particularly around rice cultivation in the Gullah Geechee area and beyond. That was again supposed to be similar to what went on in Africa, particularly Sierra Leone in that case. And so it's not just vulnerability that makes the slave the kind of figure that can give the master a sense of recognition and a sense of superiority. But when we talk about Hegel's big insights into the logic of mastery and slavery, it's going to be a combination of vulnerability and invulnerability that can placate the master's desire to remain at the center of all things, something that arguably is playing out in some of our discourse now. I'll take a moment to address some of the images here, particularly this image that the cursor is hovering over here on the left of the presentation. This is a rather shocking figure. This is a figure named Whipped Peter. And this was maybe, I hesitate to say definitively, but this image would have been, in its day during the Civil War, akin to the 8 minutes and 46 seconds of video footage. This was, this image in particular was a wake-up call, a confirmation of the brutality of slavery. This is from a slave that that escaped Louisiana plantations and made his way to a Union fort where he ended up serving in the Army. And this was his photo upon intake at a medical inspection. I'll also note that the field surgeon at the time said that his wounds were not atypical, that he saw a lot like this. There's a movie that's going into production next year about his life, starring Will Smith. No further comment there. So in any case, I'll be going through a lot of this material, particularly with regard to Hegel and the bits that I've been talking about, the logic of slavery, the logic of perceiving the other as vulnerable and invulnerable. This will be a major focus in the philosophy of race class taking place next spring. Okay, moving forward. In the second chapter of the book is called Non-Cartesian Sums Reconsidered. And here I won't go into great depth, but I'm going, in this presentation, in the interest of time, I'm going to draw here on a couple of major figures, namely W.E.B. Du Bois, the Harlem Renaissance philosopher, and the contemporary philosopher Charles Mills, and look at their understanding of self-consciousness in the wake of Hegel, in the wake of some of these concepts that I've introduced here, and in particular, looking at Charles Mills and his analysis of Ralph Waldo Ellison's Harlem Renaissance novel, The Invisible Man, and how the Black experience as portrayed by Du Bois and Mills variously ends up maybe upending dominant assumptions within Western philosophy. You might have heard the René Descartes. You might remember Cartesian planes from graphing algebra functions back in the day, or even more recently. This is all related to René Descartes and the famous dictum, the famous saying that sort of sets modern philosophy on its course: I think, therefore I am. This idea that self-consciousness, how one is aware of oneself, is a matter of absolute certainty. Even if everything else is uncertain, even if one's perception of the outside world is maybe messed up in some way, one can still be certain, for René Descartes, of one's own existence. What these figures from the Black philosophical tradition articulate in various ways is that having this certainty of one's existence, this certainty of self-consciousness, might not be a universal starting point, and indeed might be problematic. So I'll be presenting this framework as a jumping off point for my third chapter. My third chapter being called Melancholy and Anxiety. And here, getting further into what Ralph Waldo Ellison's Invisible Man, and here we have a depiction of the final scene of the book, where he retreats into darkness, becoming kind of a hermit. And Here I'm seeking to extend Judith Butler's reading of surveillance culture and Michel Foucault's model of the panopticon prison of society as a kind of all-encompassing prison, with reference to overseers in African American life, from slavery forward, and looking at overseers and surveillance more recently in the internet and mobile phone cameras. I'm going to here extend what's going on in Charles Mill's work, and to show that what's going on with Butler and her adoption of Freud in this language of melancholy is maybe a little bit lacking. If we dig deeper into Freud and into his technical definition of anxiety, anxiety is a sort of uncertainty about one's existence. Is this even real? Is this really happening? This can't be real, can it? That kind of primal anxiety. This is maybe prior to any sort of understanding of everyday life as melancholic, and maybe more applicable to the Black experience. I want to just take a brief aside, brief, and with regard to this chapter, Melancholy and Anxiety, and what I presented here, this was actually work that I did as an undergraduate. This is my undergraduate thesis. For faculty members out there, this is also a confession on my part. I'm a lazy writer, and I have no compunction about reusing material from my past. This was work that I did for my undergraduate thesis that I did in collaboration with faculty members as a part of research grants. It's the same sort of thing that we do here on campus that I'm eager to do with students. So as I'm presenting this, I want to make clear that even though some of this stuff might sound complex, and if it doesn't, great, but if it does, this still can be within your grasp. And this kind of work and this sort of technical approach to refining and addressing the complexities of race in America, this is stuff that we can do on campus and that we should be striving for, and that I'm eager to join you in. Okay, moving on. So a little bit more here, and again, forgive me for these. Well, I shouldn't say forgive me, but forgive these upsetting images. I have a fourth chapter called Black Bodies That Matter Beyond Interpellation, and I want to here suggest that certain ways of presenting bodies in death that we've perhaps seen play out with Emmett Till, very famously from the 1960s, and his death at the hands of racist vigilantes in Mississippi, to more sort of recent examples, particularly George Floyd, and way in which imagery around that incident has seared its way into America's national consciousness. The way that even though people like Till might have been called out, might have heard that, hey, you, might have heard a lot worse in the moments preceding their death. There's a way in which they are beyond interpellation. They are beyond being called out in death. And the way, and moreover, a way in which they call to us. They call us to action. They make a call upon our sense of self, upon our self-consciousness. My claim, and I'm still trying to work this out in detail, but the claim that I'm working with here is that when we come across incidents like this, that's shocking to everybody, particularly to Black people, of course, but it's shocking to everybody, because what goes on in these moments shows an inability of certain people to comply with these ritual scripts for survival, where people didn't even have the chance to live out a really crappy, really painful, melancholic mode of life, where just in showing up to the scene, just in being vulnerable, just in showing up in the everyday, they were not denied the chance to even follow out that really, really bad script. And that this is shocking to all of us, that all of us make a bargain to enact certain rituals in order to get by. That we have certain grooming rituals, that we have certain sort of role-based rituals, depending on whether we're students, whether we're teachers, whether we're administrators, whether we're counter workers at the Walgreens, whether we're first responders, whether we're this, whether we're that. All of us have certain things we do in order to maintain our sense of gender and our gender presentation. Certain things we do with regard to race, and to maintain a certain sense of identity, sense of coherence there. And when we're not allowed to even take up those scripts as fraught with inequity as they might be, that is particularly galling. And that in these incidents, when we see the body put on display in this way, after acts that shock the conscience, that shock the logic of becoming an everyday person in society that follows scripts, that this is precisely what's going on when we feel that call to action. So this is my attempt to unpack that feeling of obligation that many of us feel, and that Judith Butler laid out herself in that opening quote. And then finally, my last chapter, and this is where I'm really hoping that students can help me, faculty too, but students all the more so. The chapter that I'm calling Black Girl, Magical Realism. We have the Black Girl Magic sort of hashtag from Twitter, Instagram, beyond, and we have the trope within literature of magical realism that's particularly prominent within African American literature, and I want to not just combine these hashtags together, the hashtag and slogans and whatnot together for marketing purposes, but because there's something really substantial going on here. So here I start by extending my work in my forthcoming book. Gosh, I just changed the title of the book. Forgive me. Reconsidering the Life of Power. That's the current title. And taking that and critiquing what I see as maybe a flaw with Judith Butler's work in general when it comes to the aesthetics of ritual, when it comes to the role of art and literature, basically. My main finding in my earlier book is that in engaging in art and in sort of working on ourselves as a sort of artistic project, like what you see in types of bodily cultivation, particularly prominent in East Asian philosophy, that we set up a different kind of other. Instead of having this sort of conflict with the other that defines self-consciousness, that maybe there's other possibilities for this other. I then pivot to my positive argument, and here I'm trying to say that within Black feminist magical realism, there's often this rejection of any idea that there's an easy kind of A leads to B leads to C kind of narrative, where truth is to be found in just simply tracing things back in a linear fashion. So when we're in those scenes in our everyday life, when we're called out and we're kind of interrogated, who are you really? That we're put in this position, we can't tell the whole story of who we are. We can't tell the whole story. I can't tell the whole story of Blackness, of masculinity, of whiteness. I'm part white too. I can't tell the whole story of mixed racedness. I can't tell the whole story of all of this in America. I'm insinuated within the larger story. I'm implicated within it, but I can't tell the whole thing, let alone my own biography, which is fraught with trauma and is difficult itself to relate. So what we see in this type of magical realism, and it's really prominent with the work of queer Black women, where in real life there's just so much trauma and loss beyond accounting. We see an attempt to tell a story in a different fashion. It goes past what can be proven with a bunch of facts arranged in a linear fashion. So this is what happens with authors like Garrison, Audre Lorde, more recently, maybe even add Roxane Gay to the list. And this it's where you have a spinning of fable and fiction into truth to fill in the gaps. And so even though it's a little bit far away from Butler's own approach to the dilemmas of queer life in America, I want to show that there's a real necessity to working through art and artifice in the project of making Black bodies matter, and that this might help us work through both melancholy as a technical condition and anxiety too. They're so prevalent in the construction of Blackish normative subjects like myself. So to conclude, taking on the project of Black Bodies That Matter means investigating the ways, historical and contemporary, in which people, on a physical and visceral level, fail to matter like they should in these smaller moments until it is too late in impossibly grave tragedies that loom over and form a horizon for Black life every day. This means examining how the structural features of power preempt proper grief, prevent complete mourning, and preclude full experience of loss. It means trying to find ways, despite these deeply entrenched obstacles, to enable all people to actively remember that Black bodies matter well before they become Black corpses beyond interpellation. A book taking on the topic of Black Lives Matter and using the influential approaches to subject life pioneered by Judith Butler stands, by its very nature, at the intersection of race, class, and gender. In this regard, this project can be both timely and of lasting influence in addressing persisting issues within critical theory. This is an area that philosophy and academic inquiry, like we're carrying out here, can and should address boldly. This project, Black Bodies That Matter, stands ready to do so. Thank you for giving me your time. Now, go out into that night, early evening in this case.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garrison, for sharing your insights, your work, and especially the opportunity that you've invited students now to join you in this work. I hope that the students we have logged in here today will consider this as an opportunity for sure. I appreciate the insights you provided into the writing process as well. I think that's something maybe students could think about, the importance of the work that they're doing now as undergrads. So thank you. And certainly the content that you've shared, I think only adds to how you started the presentation, this idea of collective outrage. So I appreciate that. Certainly we'll open up for questions if folks are willing to hang out. Dr. Garrison, do you mind sticking around for a bit? I see that we're coming up on the 4 o'clock hour.
Yeah, of course. I'm sorry, I might have gone too long. I do apologize.
No, not at all. I appreciate the fullness of what you've shared. So let me take a look here in the chat box. A lot of accolades are coming in. Certainly, if folks have questions, we will stick around for a moment.
So I see Daniel Eggers has his hand up. Shall we?
Let me see if I can unmute here.
Yeah. Yeah, if you can administer that, that'd be great. Thank you.
There we go. All right, Daniel, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask a question if you'd like. We can't hear you yet if you're speaking.
You may want to try typing in your question.
Yeah. Is it working now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Something that I've noticed in the larger Black Lives Matter movement has just been like which specific Black bodies that people are willing to rally around. and it's typically been like straight cis men that get like higher rallying cries. But I've noticed like Breonna Taylor got less attention than George Floyd did. And while George Floyd came with a video that was very startling and very calling to action. But then Tony McDade, a transgender man, was killed the very next day, and very few people have heard his name. And I wondered if you could speak about the intersectionality regarding the movement. And yeah, sorry.
Oh no, you're fine. Nothing to apologize for, and it's certainly sorry, just a small technical issue on my end. It's certainly something worth addressing. So I'm afraid that my thoughts here might be a little bit preliminary, but off the top of my head, yeah, that I will readily concede that we have sort of different visibilities and different levels of mattering, even within a population that generally only matters somewhat. There's a large amount of gradation there, and as you clarify, you have the way in which sort of necropolitics get the politics of death are especially pernicious when it comes to trans folk. It's the sort of thing that we've seen play out in other ways with sort of the vulnerability around COVID too. But one thing that I want to look at historically, which is important to me as a mixed race person and somebody who's maybe who benefits, I shouldn't say maybe, I shouldn't qualify that, who does benefit from a certain kind of enhanced visibility or a degree of privilege within the Black community, colorism being particularly important. So there's this conversation's been going on for quite some time. Something that we see going back to slave times, quite literally, where we have the preponderance of quote unquote high yellow people who would look like me or lighter, were the products of sexual violence, of rape, of masters against their slaves, and who tended to work more indoors versus populations that were unmixed, which tended to work more outdoors. So that the split between house and field slaves, what we see in the Harlem Renaissance with the prevalence of what are called brown paper bag clubs. So when we had this sort of high watermark of culture during the Jazz Age, centered around Harlem, but not only there, it was quite common to see discrimination within the Black community, where if a person were darker than a brown paper bag, they would be denied entry at the door of various establishments, and where such norms played out in sort of more subtle contexts as well. To what we see with the literature of passing of people of light skin adopting a white persona and sort of hiding, concealing Black identity, to the way in which employment prospects and any number of socioeconomic indicators tend to correlate with skin color in Black populations. So I think that's one instance that I'm personally really interested in trying to account for, and that I think is, and which that admittedly that's not intersectional as of yet, but where there is there are clear grades of visibility. There's clear grades of even being recognized as even half recognized. So that's all stuff that is of big interest to me. Now, where it becomes intersectional in my account, and what I'm drawing on, at least as a beginning, and certainly where I need to do more work to push things forward, largely going to the work of Bell Hooks here, who's not the only voice on this, but is probably the most impactful voice in the last 40 or so years on this. She has a landmark book, as mentioned before, Ain't I a Woman, which references the speech that Sojourner Truth made to a feminist audience, I think in Seneca Falls in the 1860s, but where the plight of Black women is very often underrepresented, underrecognized within white dominant feminist discourse, and likewise within queer discourse, the same patterns prevailing. So that's where I'm drawing on, at least philosophically, for it. I'm definitely interested in hearing more. I was aware of the incident that you mentioned, although the name escapes me, which itself is indicative of the problem. So I think it's imperative that we have these discussions and that we draw attention. Now that the challenge, and I want to throw this back at you, Daniel, and you don't have to answer right now, but maybe just something for all of us to cogitate on. The challenge is going to be how to bring visibility to invisible populations, how to give us even the vocabulary to talk about such things where the conversations are foreclosed. Butler's approach is rooted in the sort of AIDS quilt externalization of loss. I don't know what's appropriate here, and I'm very much eager to hear your thoughts and thoughts from everybody else on that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was that was really informative. Um, as far as, I mean, obviously, as you can probably tell by my picture, I am not someone who is a part of the Black experience, and that's not something that I can ever experience. But I just I think that in regards to any educational format of any educational format period should include and not omit specific, like with specifically public education or any education at all, omits diverse experiences, be that people of color or queer experiences or diverse or like women or any of that. So just specifically increasing the visibility within courses that we already have I feel like is very important. And just having conversations within conversations to acknowledge the diversity within diversity, I feel like is very important.
Can I add a small addendum to my previous remark? This is something that your comment occasioned, Daniel. So I very much agree that bringing visibility to underrepresented populations is crucial. But one thing that I think it's crucial to keep in mind that I see being problematic, even in some classroom encounters, would be where visibility is not consensual. So I know that I've had this happen quite a bit where I've tended to be in white spaces for most of my educational career. And when we get to reading the one book in February in Black History Month or whatever, then inevitably, being made to be the representative, being put on the spot to answer for the entirety of Black experience.
Yeah, tokenized.
Yeah, it's something that I see play out, and and I have my own thoughts on this, and it might be against orthodoxy. I don't typically with students do the kind of thing where we might go around and give our gender pronouns. And this is not because of any sort of Jordan Peterson like, trans antagonism or anything like that, but because I've had trans students who have talked about these moments as being really uncomfortable, that where for people that have an apparently cis gender identity that it's sort of non-problematic, but everybody's kind of waiting until it gets to the one weird kid in class to say what they are, who they are,
Mm-hmm.
And that this can be really really problematic, and where visibility is combined with consent. I think we avoid such issues, but just defaulting to visibility for visibility's sake, I think can cause harm.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniel.
Wonderful. If anyone else has questions, feel free to unmute, or if you'd like to use the chat box. And just to clarify, I've had a few questions here. The presentation will be shared on the BW event page. I will also send out an email so you have a direct link. And Dr. Garrison has provided some additional resources that he's recommending for future follow-up as well as engagement options. So I will make sure that those are included as well.
Mm-hmm. And I'm actually going to send out a PDF for this Blackboard thing right now using the share function with the last two slides, the additional literature and the additional resources. Give me just half a second here. That should be
wonderful. So I'm not seeing any additional questions. So just want to thank you, Dr. Garrison, for presenting this afternoon, and to all of you who for attending. A recording of today's session will be posted on YouTube, as well as the additional resources will be available on the Civic Leads webpage. Today's presentation was the first of several in this series on racism. We hope you will join us next Tuesday at 7 p.m. for the Politics of Race, presented by Dr. Tom Sutton from the Department of Politics and Global Citizenship. We would love to have more students tune in for this. So if you are a faculty member who's willing to reach out to advisees or students in your summer courses, we would really appreciate your help in encouraging students to attend. If you're a student, please post on your social media, text your friends. We'd love to have more people be a part of this series. As Christy mentioned earlier, today's event and this series is just the start of a conversation. We want to engage as many voices and perspectives as possible. So if you have a story to tell or a topic to explore, please contact us at the Brain Center. So thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon/evening.
Hi.
Dr. Garrison, were you able to share that document, or did you email it to me?
I just, I have to, sorry. I guess that's all it does. I'll email it to you.
Okay, perfect. And I'll make sure that goes out to everyone then.
Okay.
Thank you so much again. It is so nice I'm sad that we are only virtually meeting, but really great to meet you and learn about the tremendous work that you're doing. And if the Brain Center can be supportive in any way as you move forward with this work or any of your other efforts, I hope that you'll reach out, and we are excited to collaborate and connect. So.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry that we didn't have more discussion back and forth. That might have gone on a little bit too long, but
no worries. And I think the content, the material you were sharing was so important. So yeah, we didn't want to stop it or cut it short. So absolutely.
Okay. Well, thank you. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the next session of the series.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Be well. Take care.
You too. Bye.